anything you may have reflected on it certainly is going to relate to one of the three themes that we'll look at in Tobit today. And you'll see shortly what's at stake for the author in that set of questions. I'd like to give you a little bit of a background on this book, and that's what I'm going to do in this particular segment here. So I'm going to bring up my screen and share with you. Let me get to work here in advance. There we go. So a little bit of information about the book of Tobit. If you were to look in a Protestant Bible, chances are pretty good you would not find the book of Tobit, or you would find it in an appendix under the title Apocrypha. You will find it in a Catholic Bible, although within Catholicism it's referred to as deuterocanonical, or part of the second canon. And the reason for this is that historically, of course, the books of the Hebrew scriptures were written in Hebrew until you reach a point around 300 where the Jews are being ruled by the Greeks, and they are Hellenizing the Jews. In other words, forcing them to become like Greeks, to speak Greek and write in Greek, among other things. And at this time, then the entirety of the Hebrew canon is translated into Greek. Books written after that point in time are written in Greek. Fast forward to Martin Luther and the Reformation, and he is eager to get a copy of the Bible in the hands of ordinary people to read in their own language. And I think for kind of purity reasons, he goes back to the Hebrew version of the Old Testament books. And so anything that was written in Greek does not get put into the Protestant Bible, and that becomes, if you will, the template for the Protestant canon going forward. On the other hand, that Greek translation, which is called the Septuagint, was used in the early church. And then when the Mediterranean communities were primarily speaking Latin, around 400, St. Jerome translates the Septuagint into Latin in a version that's called the Vulgate. And that's used by the Catholic community pretty much through into the last century. So there's a difference there. We have complete Greek texts of the book of Tobit. Interestingly, when the book of Tobit, or excuse me, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Qumran in 1947, it was found fragments of each one of the chapters in Hebrew and Aramaic. So all 14 all the chapters of Tobit were present there, which has led biblical scholars to think that the book actually was written in either one of those languages, and those languages are grouped together under the title of Semitic languages. It's not written originally in Greek, but actually in either Hebrew or Aramaic. When we look to try to figure out who the author might have been, we look for clues within the text. The author clearly was concerned with life in the diaspora. If you're not familiar with that term, the diaspora means all the Jews living outside of Israel. As we talked about last week in the Ruth segments, when an empire conquered the Jews, it was common at the time to then take a large percentage of the citizens and disperse them among the other nations of the conquered peoples. And this was a very good maneuver because it meant that if you took especially the leaders, there was nobody to organize a follow-up rebellion. So it helped reinforce your power. So if that happens successively, which is what happened to the Jews, over the course of time, you end up with more people living outside of Israel than living inside. And that creates a whole set of concerns about how do I maintain my Jewish identity? And that's certainly a theme that's very important to Tobit. The author of Tobit is also very well versed in the Hebrew scriptures, very well educated. So we see them referenced, all different parts. If you think you heard strains of Job in there, you were meant to hear strains of Job in there. If you thought, well, my goodness, the death of Tobit certainly reminds me of the death of the patriarchs in Genesis, it's meant to the wedding, apart from the demon, the wedding of Tobias and Sarah is meant to parallel the marriage of Rebecca and Isaac. There's a lot of quotes from the Psalms. There's references to Isaiah in several different places. The prophets are well represented. And of course, it's the Deuteronomy's, Deuteronomy's theology that is pepper in the entire book of Tobit. Where is it located? Where was the author located who wrote it? There are several theories. Perhaps it's he or she, probably he. I've not read anything that indicates it might have been a woman. The author perhaps was located in Egypt because there's some references to Egypt geographically. There was a popular tale, very popular folk tale in Egypt called the Tale of Ahikar. And the author of Tobit borrows from that. He even borrows the hero Ahikar and makes him to Tobit's nephew at a certain point in the book. It could be in Mesopotamia. That's the setting for the book. But then we kind of wonder because there's some geographical mistakes there. And somebody who lived in Mesopotamia probably wouldn't make those mistakes. Maybe it's in Palestine. We find toward the end of the book that Tobit is singing about the return to Palestine and how eventually everyone's going to come back to Jerusalem and it'll be rebuilt. Well, if Palestine is so important to the author, why isn't the author writing about Palestine? So nobody really knows. It's basically what it comes down to. So I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to bring up a little bit of a history of Israel that I put together that hopefully can help us understand a little bit more. Last week, in Ruth, we looked at the beginning part of the biblical period, the patriarchs and matriarchs, the settling of Canaan, the kingdoms, and we had read a little bit about the captivity, and I'm going to take us back to there. So the Assyrians, rose up in power throughout the Middle East, and they conquering everybody. So they come and try to conquer the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, right? The northern and the southern kingdoms. So they succeed at conquering the northern kingdom in 721, and they take off 28,000 of their leading citizens and disperse them around the surrounding community. Babylon, yes, and then I wanted to make sure I told you that Judah, the southern kingdom, is not conquered through a strange little miracle that's recorded in the book of Isaiah, and it is a miracle that they are able to fend off the great army of Assyria, and they do, however, have to pay tribute. So they're allowed to maintain their existence, but as a tributary of the Assyrian Empire. 150 years later, Babylon rises up in power. They are able to topple the southern kingdom and they send Judah's king and its citizens into exile. In 538, the Persians in modern day Iran, the Persians rise up and defeat the Babylonians. Cyrus the Great, who is the great conqueror there for that empire, sends people back home, and he encourages them to rebuild their religious infrastructure, to rebuild their societies. And so a number of Jews leave Babylon and head back under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The next great superpower there is going to be the Greeks. Helen is a name for the Greek peninsula, and so it's referred to as the Hellenistic age. And it begins with Alexander the Great, who in a very short period of time, right, 9 years, is able to create this huge empire around the Eastern Mediterranean, including the conquering of Israel. He dies rather young, and his generals, because he has no children, his generals divide up the empire. Ptolemy gets what's now called Palestine, and begins to move Greeks into that, send more Jews out, right? So now we have this period at which there are more Jews outside of Palestine than in it. This gets worse under the ruling of the other general, because the Seleucids, Seleucus is the other general, his descendants, the Seleucids, are aggressive, and they take over the part of the kingdom that was the empire, excuse me, that was ruled by the Ptolemies. So, and they are very forceful. So there's kind of this gradual turning up of the Hellenization of the Jews, which they grow in resentment about constantly. And this kind of crescendos with a king named Antiochus IV, who is so arrogant that he gives himself the title Epiphanes, right? Epiphany. He is the incarnation of God here on earth. And he marches him, he insists, first of all, that the Jews have to speak Hebrew. They have to speak Greek. People are arrested and imprisoned for using any kind of traditions from the Jewish culture. And but the worst is he marches into the Holy of Holies and he sets up a statue of himself. OMG, right? Tips everything, and the people rise up in revolt, and they're led by the high priest Matthias and his sons in a form of guerrilla warfare around the year 167 BCE. And this begins the Maccabean revolts, and they set up their own dynasty called the Hasmonean dynasty. So that gives you a little bit of a background that will help you understand some of the issues that we're looking at within Tobit. So let me go back to my PowerPoint here and give you a little bit more of the background. We'll look first of all at a map of the Assyrian Empire. Oops, too fast there. So in this map, we can see the growth of the Assyrian Empire. It's the dark green section at the beginning of what this map represents in 824. So it's a quite substantial kingdom already, but then it surges, and the light green is all of what becomes part of the Assyrian Empire. If you go and look over around the Mediterranean Sea, there in the southeast corner of it, you'll see the kingdom of Judah, which resisted and was not totally conquered by the Assyrians. If you go up into the dark green area, you'll notice a little tiny red dot next to the city of Nineveh. That's the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. It's on the Tigris River, and to the southwest of the Tigris is the Euphrates, and they empty into the Persian Gulf. You will recall, as I do from my 6th grade social studies, that this was the Fertile Crescent, the Mesopotamian region where civilization first arose for humankind. This is quite far along in that development, but that's what we've got going on here. If you take a look just to the right of the dark green area, but in the light green area, you'll see the city of Ecbatana, which is where Sarah and her family live. Rages, which is where Tobias and Raphael are headed, is not on the map. It's a smaller town, and so it's not on this map. When we try to date the composition of the book, we would start by saying, well, it's set in the Assyrian Empire. It must have been written then. But the mistake in the names of the kings, some of them are not correct, and the order of the Assyrian kings, along with the mistakes in the geography, lead scholars to believe it was not written then. Also, when you add to that, the themes that are present in the book of Tobit were not important during the time of the Assyrian Empire. They were important around 200 BCE. So themes like how we live the diet, how do we follow the dietary laws, and the question of endogamy. Endogamy means marrying someone within your ethnic group or tribe. Those are issues around 200 BCE. Could we push it later than that? Could it be an even earlier book? Excuse me, an even later book. No, because the closer you get to that turning of the dial and that crescendo with Antiochus Epiphanes leading to the Maccabean revolt, there becomes more and more of an anti-Greek rhetoric present in Jewish writing. So, in Israel, Palestinian, Jewish writing is probably the best word to use there. So we know it's before the Maccabean Wars. So that gives us a ballpark for where this is at. And one other lovely thing that I want to share with you as background is a little bit of the message that's in the names. It was common in the ancient Near East to have names mean something. A person's name was significant. And so an author would choose the name to convey a message. And Jeffrey Miller, who writes the commentary for Tobit in the Paulist Biblical Commentary, has analyzed it this way. And I just thought it was a great way for us to see how clever and erudite uh, the author of this book was. So the message of the entire book of Tobit can be gleaned from the names of the characters. So here's Miller's analysis. In response to people's calamities, Yahweh helps them, which is what the name Azariah means, and heals them, is what the name Raphael means. God is a good God, Tobit and Tobias, and a dear friend, Raguel, whose gracious favor, Anna, will bring them joy, Edna. So even the women's names are part of the message here. I'm going to give you a little bit of a break and end this video. And then when you come back, we'll take a look at some of the themes that are in the book.